Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on MormonMentalHealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mormon Mental Health Podcast. I am Jimmy Bridges, one of your hosts, and with us today is Emily Janes. Before we jump right in, I just want to give a shout out to those who support the podcast, listeners and donators. We really appreciate and rely heavily on your donations. And so if you want to donate or you're able to, you can go to mormonmentalhealth.org and click the donate button. Emily, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. So if you could, I'll just let you introduce yourself at this point and maybe talk a little bit about some of the ideas, concepts we're going to be going into today.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about me. My name is Emily Janes, and I am a recent graduate just this past week of the Marriage and Family Therapy program at Virginia Tech University. And so the project that I'll be talking a little bit about today was actually my thesis for the program. And so what I looked at was the impact of disaffiliation from the LDS Church on how women view the concept of womanhood and view themselves as women. And so it was a qualitative study, and so pretty open-ended and very exploratory to see kind of what that impact looks like and kind of how women processed how disaffiliation changed how they viewed themselves as women. And so that's kind of the broad overarching description of the project. And then there were lots of themes and specific things in there that we'll probably talk a little bit more in depth about.
Okay. Do you have any, so I know you had mentioned before, like main theory that really guided a lot of this stuff. Could you go into that a little bit?
Sure. And so the main theory that we used, or that I used to kind of think about this project was a smaller theory that's not used very often called hybrid identity theory. And hybrid identity theory is generally used to examine the encounter, conflict, and or blending of two ethnic or cultural categories. So which they're not pure or distinct in nature, but they tend to be understood and experienced as meaningful identity labels by members of those categories. And so usually this theory is used to look more at individuals who have immigrated from one country to another or transnational families, but you can use it to look at gender, kind of thinking about different cultural meanings around gender and how those blend in an individual. And so we used hybrid identity theory to kind of conceptualize this study, thinking about moving from the culture and the cultural standards of what it means to be a woman in the LDS Church, and kind of what happens when you take yourself out of that culture or remove yourself from those teachings, and kind of how does that mix, how does that mesh different cultural meanings of what it means to be a woman. And so that was kind of the idea around the study is, when you identify yourself as a post-Mormon woman, can that be considered a hybrid identity of kind of mixing together different cultural meanings or cultural understandings of womanhood?
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Is this like idea that being post-Mormon is an identity of it in and of itself? Is that kind of introducing that kind of idea as well, that we don't just lose that part of us, but it kind of changes as opposed to losing? Okay.
Yeah. And so the argument that I tried to make throughout the paper was that a post-Mormon identity kind of combines the identifying factors of woman. Like if you're a post-Mormon woman, like I'm a woman, I'm still a Mormon in some meaning of the word, and I've also removed myself from the teachings of the church, and so I'm also a post-Mormon. And that post part of identity looks different for every individual, but that was kind of the argument that I was trying to make, was that post-Mormon identity is a new way of identifying myself that still includes that Mormon piece. And it looks different for everyone, but that Mormon piece doesn't just disappear, which is one of the premises of hybrid identity theories, that even when our identities change, those identifying factors are still there. They just influence and impact us in a different way.
I see. Okay. So it's not necessarily this idea of I'm now the absence of something I had, but I do have something that's transformed and evolved.
Right. Yeah. And they're all kind of coexisting at the same time. I have an image, I might be able to show it here, but it's like a pyramid almost of like an identity hierarchy, that as we kind of adapt and change and learn new things and identify with other roles, different cultures throughout our lives, that hierarchy, the pieces just move around. They don't disappear and we can't like toss them out. They just move around and have a different amount of salience or impact on how we view ourselves. And that can change even moment by moment or experience by experience, but that those pieces all just kind of move around.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so let's get into this. But I guess before we do that, could you share a bit of like what led you down this road?
Sure. No, and it was definitely a journey. This is not at all what I thought coming into my master's program. It's not at all what I thought I would do. And so thinking about kind of the journey and how I got here, I think it's important to note that I was raised in the church. I was born into a pretty, I think we're 7th generation LDS. So we've been in the church for a really long time. And the church growing up was a really important part of my identity and a part of my family's identity. But as I grew up, a lot of family members and friends chose to disaffiliate from the church, including one of my sisters and my parents. And so I very intimately experienced kind of how disaffiliation impacts all sorts of things, but especially our identities. Because I felt it as a family member, like how does disaffiliation impact my family's identity? But I also had a very close-up view for my parents and for my sister of what that looked like and felt like for them. And so when I was kind of starting to brainstorm what I could do for my thesis, I remembered kind of watching my family go through this change and watching as they kind of deconstructed their identities and had to figure out kind of who they were moving forward outside the church. And so that's kind of what led me to this study, was watching them, and especially watching the women in my life. It looked like they had a little bit of a different process, kind of renegotiating their identities, especially because many of them left because of women's issues in church, the treatment of women in church. And so that's kind of what brought me to this, was kind of this discussion, what does that look like? And how, from my view as a clinician, like how clinicians help in that process, and how can we help through the identity crisis and through the identity negotiation process.
Okay. So maybe if we can at this point kind of go through main things that you had found, or maybe like what questions you had going into this. Maybe we could start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the main kind of overarching question that we wanted to really look at and dig into was, how did leaving the Mormon church change how you view yourself as a woman and your overall view of womanhood? Kind of how do you conceptualize for yourself and just in general what womanhood is and what it means to be a woman? So we asked all sorts of questions of our participants. I asked a lot of questions about context, kind of when did you start to doubt the church? What were your main questions? Were women's issues a part of the questions that you had? Kind of how did people respond to you? So I asked a lot about context, and then kind of how on the tail end of the interview, we dug more into womanhood. And so how were you raised to view womanhood? What did you believe about yourself as a woman before you disaffiliated, during disaffiliation, post disaffiliation? Kind of what did that look like for you? And so that was where most of the focus was kind of on the context of their disaffiliation and kind of how that impacted things. But then also how did your core beliefs about yourself as a woman change as you went through the disaffiliation process, and then post disaffiliation, how has it continued to change?
Mm.
And so those were the main questions that we asked. And do you want me to just jump into the findings?
Yeah, themes and right.
Okay. And like I said, it was a qualitative kind of exploratory study. So slow me down and definitely ask questions if I'm going too fast, because there were a lot of themes.
Yeah.
A ton of themes and a ton of sub-themes. And so the first theme, and just to kind of preface it kind of takes you, the way that I constructed the paper and the way that I kind of set everything up, it almost takes you through a journey of kind of like how people felt pre and then post disaffiliation.
Okay.
And so the first theme that we kind of dug into was that many of the participants spoke deeply about feeling limited by church teachings, kind of thinking about themselves as women and thinking about the role of women in the church. Many participants, almost every participant, talked about feeling very limited by the teachings in the church on womanhood. And so what that meant for a lot of the women was that they felt that growing up, they were given almost this blueprint of what it means to be a Mormon woman. One of the questions that I asked was kind of, what do you remember in young women's or primary? What do you remember learning about womanhood and what it meant to be a woman? And every single participant without fail talked about how being a righteous woman in the church means three things. It means being a mom, being a wife, and then more specifically being a stay-at-home mom and having that work in the home. And so many of the participants talked about how kind of being given this blueprint or this mold to fit as a Mormon woman felt extremely limiting. And so there were two sub-themes in kind of this overall theme of feeling limited by church teachings. And those two sub-themes were that many of the participants discussed never thinking of their own future. And so that's the first sub-theme, is I never thought of my own future. And so many women talked about how there was really no need for them to think about their own futures, and how they felt that, well, I was given this blueprint, I was given this mold to fit, and I believe that it's true. And so I'm going to go down that path. And I don't need to think about kind of what I want to do if there's something outside of that, because it's been given to me. And so that was the first sub-theme, was many of the women talking about kind of this feeling of not thinking of their own future and not really having the need to think of their own future. And then the second theme, which is pretty connected to that first sub-theme, is that many of the women felt that they didn't live up to their potential because of kind of this idea of fitting the mold or fitting this blueprint that they were given. They felt that they didn't live up to their potential, kind of in retrospect, thinking about what they could have done or what they wanted to do, that they didn't live up to that potential. And so that was the first kind of theme, and the first two sub-themes were thinking about those limitations. And then kind of, that they didn't think about what they wanted to do because they trusted and believed that that blueprint and that mold that they needed to fit was what they needed to do and kind of what they needed to carry with them moving forward.
I'm wondering, with just this question here, this main theme, did you find, or maybe like whether this was directly from data or just from your research, or if you want to pull your own kind of analysis of culture from your perspective,
Sure.
like what were there things that, I guess the word that I'm thinking right now is facilitator, like a facilitator of that story, of like what pushes that story or maintains it or keeps it going.
Yeah.
Especially like, I guess when we think of like an idea like effort to kind of move out of that story is sometimes met with some backlash to keep you in that, or just other influences that just help, or not help, but like maintain that kind of story moving
Sure.
forward. Were there any I don't know, influences that you could see?
Yeah. I think two things that are immediately coming to mind is thinking about kind of the association with the word righteous, and that to be kind of good and righteous and viewed well in the church and then by God, since it was a teaching that many of the women felt like this is the thing that I have to do. Like my exaltation and my kind of my relationship with God is dependent on fitting this mold.
Mm.
The other thing that comes to mind is something that I learned while I was preparing and researching for this project, is that oftentimes when we think about gender identity development and kind of how we start to conceptualize our gender and what it means, kind of culturally to be a part of that gender, we look at the people around us and we kind of look at the societal messages that we're being given and then the examples of the people around us. And that was one of the questions that I asked participants, was kind of what were the examples of womanhood that you had in your life, and like how many of those examples aligned with the church's teachings and how many of them didn't, and then what did you believe and feel like towards the women who didn't fit the mold and towards the ones who did. And so some of the women, and I didn't report on that. I mean, I asked a lot of questions in the interviews. And so that wasn't something that I reported on in the actual paper. But it was interesting that a lot of the women couldn't think of any examples growing up of women who didn't fit the mold. And for the few that could remember people, oftentimes it was, I felt really sad for her. Like I kind of pitied her that she wasn't married or that she didn't have kids, or I thought that they had done something wrong and that's why they were working or they didn't have children or they weren't married, right? And so I think that's probably part of it too, was that many of the participants weren't exposed to examples of women outside of kind of this mold, or this more traditional view of womanhood. And for those of them that were, they weren't in the best light, the women that they saw that were working or who were single or who were childless. And so they didn't really feel connected to those women and didn't want to be like them. And many of them expressed remorse and kind of thinking about it now in retrospect, like, I don't know why I thought that, but that was kind of the overall feeling that they had towards women who didn't fit that mold. So they thought it was bad or that it was wrong for them to not be fitting that mold.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the case, and correct me if I'm wrong, that like, say like an identity type theory or framework you're looking through as a lens, does this help to highlight this idea that we build and pick up these messages that really become a very integral part of how we see ourselves as we're like viewing other people, and that kind of accumulates over time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And especially, I think it's important to note that, again, and there's lots of different kind of theories on gender identity development. I think it's important to throw that out here. So this might not align with every theory, but one of the theories that I came across, or one of the studies that I came across, talked about almost this crossroads period of gender identity development, especially for women, of kind of that age, like 10 to 13 age range, where that's kind of when you start to solidify what it means to you, what your gender identity means to you, and kind of how you conceptualize it. And so I think it's important to note that in the church, that age range of 10 to 13 directly aligns with when you start young men and young women's classes, which is when we do start to get more, at least in my experience as a member of the church, that's when I started learning more overt messages about my gender and what it means to be a woman and kind of what's expected of me as a Mormon woman. And so I think it is important to note that that's, I mean, in that crossroads developmental period where you kind of think about, am I going to take a more traditional essentialist view of my gender or a more expanded view, that many LDS folks are then starting the young men, young women's courses where they're getting much more traditional essentialist teachings and lessons on gender. And so I think that all of that kind of thrown in together is important to note for gender identity development and kind of how we view our gender moving forward.
Yeah, this like brings up another question I have that might be a tangent, so we can return right back.
Okay.
But as you're talking, I'm just thinking maybe mandatory is not the right word, but the way you talk about, and I guess my own observations with just like the way that lessons somewhat like, you know, what happens outside of sacrament meeting for kids. I'm just wondering if you thought at all, or if it ever came to mind, of this idea of the way it's somewhat structured in a way that it's mandatory cisgender development, regardless of how folks identify.
Right.
And the way you just talked about your own words kind of made me think of that in terms of
Sure.
who are we wanting to develop what kinds of genders are we wanting to develop? And if that's not explicit, then yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely something that I thought about as I was kind of, analyzing the data and kind of setting up the project. I even in like the limitations section of my project talked about how this is an extremely binary view of gender. And I did that because it's in line with church teachings, and it's kind of in line with, since it's an exploratory study, kind of taking it at that baseline level that this is what we're taught. But I think that it's important to note that, and probably rich ground for additional research of how does that impact individuals who identify as gender non-binary, gender fluid. How does that impact them as they're in this developmental stage and trying to examine their own gender identity and what that means to them? And then they're getting all of these messages, all of these very binary, traditional, intense messages about
Yeah. So yeah, I guess that helps me. The way you clarify traditional, you narrow the scope even more with saying these are your options. It's a right. It's a cisgender traditionalist way to kind of do gender for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what other themes? What other main questions?
So the next theme that we really looked into was this idea of kind of shame and cognitive dissonance. And for many of the participants, many of the women talked about just feeling a lot of shame around this idea of being given a blueprint and being given a mold for their gender and what that looks like moving forward throughout their lives. And so there was all sorts of kind of things that they felt shame around. For many of the women, it was feeling shame around questioning the mold, kind of like, why do we have to do this? Like, why? Many women talked about like the men in the church get like infinite possibilities for their identity and for kind of what they get to choose moving forward into adulthood and emerging adulthood. Why do I only have kind of this very narrow choice of what it means to be a woman and what I can do in my life? And so there was shame around kind of questioning the mold. There was shame for women who kind of pushed back and said like, it's not really what I want for me. So there was a lot of shame about like rejecting the mold or not having a desire to fit the mold in the first place. A lot of participants could remember experiences when they were like 10, 11, 12, where they kind of went to their parents and said like, I don't think I want to be a mom. Like, I think I'd rather do this. And their parents pretty much saying like, oh, okay, like you think that now, but you'll come to realize in time that that's not really what you need to do. So there was shame around kind of pushing back against the mold, not wanting to fit the mold. And then for a lot of women, there was shame kind of later into adulthood when they did everything that the mold and the kind of blueprint told them to, but they didn't find it fulfilling. When they were struggling in these roles of being a mother or of being a wife and kind of thinking like, hey, I thought this was supposed to be the best thing for me. I thought this was supposed to be the most fulfilling, enriching job, but I don't feel fulfilled. And I feel like there's something more for me to do. Like kind of like what's that about? And then a lot of shame for kind of thinking that and for not feeling fulfilled in the first place. And so a lot of women expressed a lot of anger and sadness around that shame and cognitive dissonance of like, I don't understand why this isn't working for me. This is supposed to be the best thing, and yet here I am not feeling too great about myself. And so that was the second main theme, was kind of this idea of shame and cognitive dissonance around the mold and around kind of this blueprint of womanhood. And what does it mean for me if I don't fit it, or if I don't want to fit it, or if I fit it, but I don't feel good about fitting it. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any examples of how that was talked about by participants?
Yeah. Oh, there were all sorts of things
bet.
that came up. I think for some participants who had chosen to kind of reject the mold and said like, I get it. And I get that that's part of what I need to do, but I'm also going to pursue this route over here. A lot of them talked about how they, in their careers or in kind of these other pursuits outside of the blueprint of a Mormon woman, they discounted their accomplishments. And they brought up a lot of, it's that quote, like, of being a failure in the home, that like, I have it on right here. It's that classic Mormon quote that no success can compensate for failure in the home. And so women talked about, that's a quote from a participant, kind of talking about how that quote haunted her for years. And so even when she was doing really important things in her field of work and making a lot of accomplishments and doing wonderful things in that field, she felt like a failure in the home. And so she said, like, oh, those things aren't really that important because I'm not focusing over here where I should
Wow.
be. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so that was a big way of how that shame kind of influenced them, and how it came up was kind of discounting anything outside the home. It's not important. It's not good. It's not even where I should be focusing my attention. And so I feel a lot of shame around these areas because I should be over here. This is what I should be doing. And so that was a big way that it came up. And that word failure came up a lot in the participants as they were kind of processing this shame and cognitive dissonance of feeling like a failure if I don't look like a Mormon woman, if I don't act like a Mormon woman, if I'm not married by the time I'm 21, what does that mean for me? And a lot of women describe themselves as feeling like failures because they weren't able to, for some reason, fit this mold, or because they didn't want to, for some reason, fit this mold.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
It's a powerful, I guess, like the words you're sharing, those specific words from participants like that, it's powerful kind of depiction of, I don't know if severity is the right word, but of when things don't go according to the ideal. That's very specific.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it was there are kind of moments, and I'm sure you can relate, of when you've interviewed people, that there are moments where I can remember like the heaviness of what participants were talking about. And this is absolutely one of the times where I can just very physically remember the heaviness of participants expressing their sadness and anger, for sadness for the way that they felt about themselves, and for some of them continue to feel about themselves, but anger for kind of how these teachings and how they kind of processed and integrated those teachings into their lives, how it put them in a position where they felt very bad about themselves and really shamed themselves for decisions that they were making and developmentally appropriate questions that they were asking about what they wanted to be doing and what they wanted
Yeah.
to be moving forward.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
What else?
And so kind of the next theme was, after shame and cognitive dissonance, was thinking about kind of, and I just kind of talked about this a little bit, it was a quote from one of the participants, "I didn't feel good at all about being a woman," was the next theme. And it was talking about how, and there were 3 sub-themes for this one. So there's kind of a lot of different things that go into this theme. But the main point was that based on church teachings and based on how kind of the church is set up, many of the participants expressed feeling less than men and feeling like second-class citizens in the church. Many women talked about how it was very upsetting to feel like they had no power or authority in the church, and how they had power and authority in areas in their lives outside of the church, but then when they sat in the church and were in that role, they felt like they didn't have any power or authority in that place. And some women talked even about feeling loved less by God and being valued less by God because of their gender. One participant even talked about how she had kind of thought about it and thought about, like, okay, well, God chose to make me a woman, and God knew these things about women, and so clearly he thinks less of me because he put me in this position. And so many of the participants talked about kind of feeling loved less, valued less, and feeling like second-class citizens in the church. And so, go ahead.
Yeah. So like after you say something like that, I can hear different sides of how someone would respond to
Sure.
something like this. And maybe if you just humor me and then help me and maybe other listeners.
Yeah.
So the response that I could imagine someone maybe giving is, we don't teach that.
Right.
Absolutely not. There's no explicit teaching. We love the women in the church, and they fill such important roles, and their voices is important and is valued, and it influences the direction we go. You know, to play to a common response, I guess, to something like what you just said. This participant said, I don't know, how do you make sense of that? Because I mean, it's a common, it's not uncommon to hear something like that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that most of the narrative in the church is very much like, we love our women, and we have special roles for them. We love them. We need them. We need their voices. And so, no, that totally makes sense. And I can even admit, as the researcher, that there was a part of me that was surprised that this finding came up because, yeah, I think we all view the church teachings a little bit differently, but there was a part of me that was like, like, I never felt that way. And I wonder kind of what's coming up for me as the researcher, listening to these stories and listening to these feelings. And I think one of the things that the participants talked a lot about to kind of put a name to that feeling was kind of the impact of benevolent misogyny and benevolent patriarchy within the church, where the narrative is kind of, we pedestalize women, we put them on this pedestal, we want them to be present, we want them to be there. In some ways, they are more valuable, they're more worthy, right? That's kind of the narrative. And many of the women talked about how kind of growing up, they heard that, they believed that, they felt that. And because they heard and kind of integrated those messages, in some ways they felt empowered to kind of step up and give their voices, give their opinions. And then they described this process of being pushed off the pedestal every time. Where if these things are really true about me as a woman and about our teachings on womanhood, then why is my voice not being heard in ward council? Or why am I not being invited to this meeting? Or why do I have to get things approved when it's my class that I'm teaching, right? And so a lot of the women talked about how that was a very confusing process for them to kind of recognize, but that was part of the process of kind of coming to this conclusion of like, God must love me less, or I must be less valued because I'm put on this pedestal, but I'm pushed off the pedestal every time.
I'm glad you brought up this idea of benevolent patriarchy or misogyny or sexism. Dr. Washburn-Busk, who we recently had, went into this on a deeper level. And so I'm glad it's being looked at and considered. And then the other thought that I had when I said this and then you repeated this, like, we love our women, I guess like the dissonance that comes, maybe I don't know if this is true, but with the women that you're asking and you're interviewing in this study, the dissonance from feeling less than, perhaps that would be different if the people that said we love our women were women, but I guess they're typically not, right? Yeah.
Right. No, and I think that that's a really good point of how often, I mean, even thinking about General Conference, and I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but it's not uncommon to see kind of an analysis of how many women's voices were actually heard in General Conference. And so I think that that's an excellent point of how often do we really hear that from women, and how often do we hear from our female leaders and kind of what they're doing. And yeah, I think that's a really good point.
And is this, like, just to tie it back to your original framework?
Sure.
This idea of our identities are built upon kind of who we see earlier on, and so if we see more people who we see more options of how to do our gender. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think that that's a really important point, especially thinking about kind of one of the things that came up with this theme was thinking about, like, I don't feel like I have a lot of power or influence here. And a lot of the participants talked about how sitting in sacrament meeting and really only seeing men on the stand and seeing young boys passing the sacrament and feeling like, and this is a direct quote from one of the participants, which she said, like, I have less power than a 12-year-old boy in this room. And that is really painful for me to recognize, that I will never be able to have more power than a 12-year-old boy because of the way that the church is structured and because of the teachings. And so, no, I think that that's an excellent point of kind of who do we see in positions of power, and how does that impact what we think we can do and what we believe we can be in the church.
Yeah, I almost went on another tangent, but I'll let you continue with themes so we can get into maybe what this means
Yeah,
for our
absolutely.
community. Yeah.
And so there were, like I said, there were 3 sub-themes underneath kind of this overall theme of I didn't feel good about being a woman. And the 3 sub-themes were kind of feeling like their main role, and this is another direct quote, and the title of the sub-theme is A Caretaker of Men, feeling that their main role was to caretake for children, but also for men in the church. And so that was one of the sub-themes, was feeling like a caretaker of men, and especially thinking about kind of holding up the priesthood and being a supporter of the priesthood, and how we often conflate priesthood with men in the church. And so that was one of the sub-themes, as well as this idea of kind of constantly second guessing myself, even post disaffiliation, kind of this process of second guessing myself, second guessing my beliefs, my questions, and what I want for myself. And then the third sub theme underneath kind of not feeling good about being a woman, was that many of the participants described being raised not to have boundaries because they were these caretakers and these nurturers, and especially with men not having boundaries. More specifically, and this, unfortunately, because of the scope of the paper, and I'm hopeful that I can do more research on this in the future, but with the scope of the paper, I didn't get to go into too much depth with this, but this is where a lot of the teachings around kind of chastity and purity culture came up, of feeling like women were not only responsible for caretaking for men, but they were also responsible for maintaining men's purity and men's worthiness and virtue. And so they talked a lot about feeling responsible for men's thoughts, men's feelings, men's actions, and especially thinking about sex and sexuality, that they were responsible for being a guardian of virtue, which is a quote that we often hear in the church, which means not only maintaining my own virtue, but also making sure that the men in my life are virtuous and are doing the things that they're supposed to do. And so those were kind of the sub themes, and I can go into more detail with those if you have questions, or if not, we can just go on to the next big theme.
Yeah, we maybe for sake of time, but I did,
Right.
I guess, want to, it's nice to hear just like a replication of a lot of this stuff. Julie Azevedo-Hanks, De Azevedo-Hanks goes into a lot of this with Assertiveness Guide for Women, and Burnout Cure, I think is.
That sounds right.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Hanks, if I got that wrong. But yeah, this idea of like all of the emotional and family labor work that goes into, yeah.
Exactly. And so the next big theme was thinking about kind of this process of grief and mourning and loss that came from the choice to disaffiliate, and how that impacted not only their identity as a member of the church, but also more intimately other parts of their identities. And so the title for this next theme, which is another direct quote from a participant, was A Part of Myself That Died. And just really feeling a lot of mourning and sadness and loss around the choice to disaffiliate and what that meant for them. Which I think it's interesting to see that theme kind of put in there, and coupled with the next theme that I'll go into, was that although there was a lot of anger and sadness and resentment and shame around the teachings that they learned, there was also a great deal of sadness about leaving the church and choosing to leave the church. Many of the women talked about how they had tried for years to make it work, and how they had tried to figure out how they could be a part of it, and that ultimately they felt they couldn't, and how that was extremely painful. And many of the participants compared it to death, and compared it to a part of myself that died. It was comparable to when my sibling died. Like, the feelings of pain were very comparable to me. And so just a lot of feelings of loss and grief about leaving the church, and what that meant for them and what that meant for their identities. And this is when a lot of the participants started talking about kind of this feeling of identity crisis, and like, what does this actually mean for me if I'm leaving the church? Yes, I'm leaving kind of these teachings behind, but what does it mean for me as a person? Which I think is an important implication, like in the discussion section of the paper. I think that's an important implication to look at for disaffiliation, that it's much more than kind of where do I spend my time on Sunday mornings. It has an intimate impact on how we view ourselves as individuals. And so that was a pretty, again, kind of thinking about those heavy moments in an interview, that was another very heavy, very sad part to listen to and to kind of hold with my participants. And that leads pretty directly into the next theme, which was I'll never not be Mormon, which again was another direct quote from a participant was, even though, yes, I'm making this conscious choice to step away from the church, there is a part of me that will always be Mormon, and that will always be a part of my identity. And so many of the women talked about how it was more of a cultural identity for them as opposed to like a religious or spiritual identity, but that they still identified as like Mormon culturally. And they also used it as kind of like a heritage culture, something that connects them to their ancestors and to their families. But that was an important part for many of the participants to throw in there, was like, I'm still a Mormon. Like, even though I've left the church, that is still an important part of my identity. But along with that, and this fits into the theory, kind of what I was talking about earlier with that identity hierarchy, because it's still a part of my identity, there's this constant deconstruction of what that means, and then reintegration into my identity of what does it really mean to me to be a Mormon. And so kind of this, yeah, it doesn't end with disaffiliation, but it's this constant process of renegotiating it into my identity. And what does that look like and feel like for me?
Wow.
Yeah.
So as like, as I'm thinking of all these themes, and I'm sure you took a lot of time to consider, like what, I guess like the big question that we can kind of wrap our interview up with is what you would hope this knowledge and information um, inform some kind of change. Yeah, like what, yeah, what you hope changes or transforms because of what you're learning. And I know from previous conversations with you that this is not something you're going to continue doing this,
Right.
and it's not something you're stopping here. So maybe thinking of that as well, what you future projects you consider as you really start to consider how you want this to start to change individuals, families, community.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really good question. Kind of what do I hope might change, or kind of what does this shed light on?
Yeah. And if someone were to like hear this stuff, how how would they begin to integrate it, I guess, into their own life, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's an excellent question. I think for me, and again, kind of as my lens as a clinician and kind of doing this work from a very clinical lens, I think one of the first things that comes up for me is kind of thinking about the individual who is disaffiliating, kind of allowing there to be space for it to be a much more complex process. That it's
Mm.
not kind of, I think for many of us, as we navigate our faith and navigate our relationship with the church, and again, this is mostly speaking from myself and like my own experiences, I think for many of us, it's kind of this hope of like, I'm going to step away and it's going to be done. Like, it won't be hard anymore. It's been hard this whole time as I've kind of tried to navigate it and make a choice for myself. And now I want it to be done. Right. And so I think allowing there to be space for it to be complex, and allowing there to be space for kind of an emotional soup of lots of different emotions that are coming up, that it's okay to be sad, and it's okay to feel grief and loss and mourning around this decision. I think giving
Mm.
ourselves permission to feel that way, that even though this is a choice that I made for myself and a choice that I feel, and this is something that participants talked about, like, I don't regret my choice of leaving the church, and it was still extremely difficult for me, right? And so allowing there to be more space for that, which, and this is the last theme that we didn't get too much into, was kind of more of the intimate impact on womanhood, which was this feeling of peace and this feeling of empowerment and almost expansion as an individual, that can coexist with kind of this feeling of loss and mourning and grief and sadness, right? And so I think thinking about the individuals disaffiliating, that's part of my hope is, and probably coming from a clinical lens, is that we allow ourselves that space to feel and process all of those emotions, that it's okay to feel empowered and at peace, and to still feel grief and loss and mourning at the same time.
Do you have any examples of that last theme you mentioned about arriving at a place of contentment or?
Yeah, I do. And I can even pull up some quotes from the participants themselves.
Yeah.
I've got it pulled up right here. But many of the women talked about, kind of like I said, like this feeling of empowerment to make choices for themselves and to feel expanded as a person, that there's more for me outside of this mold if I want to choose it. And if I want there to be more, there can be more. And so they talked about kind of this ability to make choices, this ability to think for themselves, and no need for there to be a mold anymore, that I can create my own view of what it means to be a woman, which then allow there to be more space for feelings of worthiness and feelings of self-acceptance. A lot of women talked about like my confidence and self-esteem like skyrocketed post disaffiliation because I felt like I had the power to make those choices for myself. So two of the quotes that I pulled about this theme was, I felt like leaving the church expanded me. I felt like I had room to breathe. I had freedom. I could finally do the things I always wanted to do. I didn't have to sacrifice myself. None of it was what God wanted and what made me worthy. I could breathe again, and ultimately it led me to actually like myself. It's been the first time in my life that I've been able to say that. And then another quote is, my view of womanhood is finally unbound and liberated and free to become whatever I want to become. And no one is going to tell me what that means again. I no longer feel like I have to fit a mold that was never made for me. I have been fighting that mold my whole life, and I can breathe. I feel so much peace.
Wow.
And so those were some of kind of the final quotes and final thoughts of the participants when they were kind of processing, like, how did it impact how I view myself as a woman and what that means for me moving forward. And so it's interesting to see that kind of juxtaposed against that last theme of how heartbreaking it was and how heavy it was to leave the church. And yet it did bring in this feeling of peace and this feeling of confidence, like I made the right choice for me and I made the right choice for what I want to do in my life. And so allowing there to be space for both, I think, is one of my hopes.
Yeah. Is in your considerations for change or for addressing these issues, did your recommendations or considerations go as far as to consider like what families or partners could do, and then church leaders, if you went into that?
Yeah, I think I went into it briefly, kind of in the clinical implications section, just that because disaffiliation is, I mean, I think it's intense for families and intense for couples, especially if there's varying levels of activity in the church within a family or within a couple. And so I did recommend kind of allowing there to be space, not only for like, if you're thinking about it from like a therapy lens, to have space for couples therapy and for family therapy to kind of process how this, again, not only impacts the individual's identity, but also the couple's identity and the family's identity. And so leaving space for that. But I think maybe a change, and this is very similar to kind of the individual hope for the person disaffiliating, but also for the individuals around that person to recognize kind of that this is so much more than a choice of, am I going to go to church on Sunday or not, right? Like this really does have, for many people, right? And that's the hard thing about research, is that this was only consistent for like my participants. And so this isn't every person that disaffiliates from the church might not feel this way, but for my participants, at least, that it was heavy, right? And that they needed support and that they needed people to kind of rally around them. And that was something that participants talked about, was feeling very isolated during this process, and kind of how online communities in particular were very helpful during this process because they had a sense of community. But if we can recognize that in like our closer in-person communities, if we want that kind of support and help, I think that would be helpful, just for there to be a recognition at kind of that base level that it's a huge choice and it has huge implications for how we feel about and how we view ourselves. And so creating a space where we can talk about that openly and recognize that, and not just, and I think especially for members of the church who remain active, recognizing that this isn't just some flippant kind of choice to leave, but that this really is hard and it's sad, and that there is grief and loss and mourning that goes into this decision for many people. Again, that might not be true for every person that disaffiliates, but for many, it is this really heartbreaking process. And so I think having more recognition of that, and the way that we speak out people who disaffiliated and that we treat people that have disaffiliated from the church, I think is really important, because oftentimes it is much bigger than what we see on the surface.
Yeah, and I imagine maybe and perhaps, I don't know if this is too believed anymore, but it has seemed like the decision to leave has been somewhat characterized as you said flippant. I think that's a really good word. Not thought about, not considered, right? But then in reality, people agonize, for weeks, months, years over deciding to do this.
Yeah, and I think that relationally, that's an important thing to note.
Mm.
A lot of the people, or a lot of the participants talked about, and again, the scope of the paper, we didn't go into too much depth in the results section of this finding, but a lot of people talked about how it intimately impacted their relationships, right?
Yeah.
There was a lot of loss in relationship with the people that they are around, whether that was a partner that they had differing views with, like regarding the church and regarding activity in the church, but also kind of in-laws, family members, siblings, parents. I mean, there was a lot of very difficult conversations and sadness that went into kind of explaining and talking about that process with family members. And so I think that if we can have more understanding or hold more space when conversations do occur, and when the person feels ready to talk about it and want to talk about it, there's more space to really trying to understand what really happened, and not assuming, again, there are parts of me that hope that this isn't as believed as it has been in the past, but not assuming like, oh, they were offended, so they chose to leave, or they didn't think this through, or it's just a phase they're going through, but trying to really hold space and try to understand kind of what they're going through and what went into this decision. Because I think the word agonize is spot on, that people really do think about and agonize over this decision for a very long time.
Yeah. And so I'm hearing you say holding space a lot, and both for the person making this decision to hold space for the difficulty of the decision, the emotions that come flooding in, and the feelings associated with loss, and then holding space for folks in their life so that they hold space for this person going through this process. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's all just timely, fascinating, and I'm glad that, to be honest, that this is just a lot of what I'm seeing is folks doing this kind of work and finding a lot of common themes of other work being done, which is really, really awesome to see in research. Just how consistent stories become, and the more stories like this, like what you're doing, are gathered, I think cause for change and considering doing things a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
I know you're headed off to Texas Tech soon to join the doctoral program there. So best of luck with your endeavors there.
Yes, it will be an adventure.
Yeah.
I'm excited and nervous all at the same time.
Right, of course. Well, thanks again. And thank you all for all of the listeners and the donators. This has been another episode of the Mormon Mental Health Podcast. We had Emily Janes on today talking about womanhood, leaving the church, disaffiliating, and identity. So thank you again, Emily.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll. Hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will.
Obey thy will.
When thou sayest to them,
Be still.
wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest,
The peaceful rest.
then while